Welcome to the Underground, the Steel City Underground, a Pittsburgh Steelers podcast made by fans like you, for fans like you. Now, here's your host.
Hey everybody, welcome to another edition of the Steel City Underground video podcast, your home for everything black and gold. And I am Brian Roach, as I'm sometimes known Mr. Black and Gold until I'm dead and cold. I will be your host today as we hit on a topic that we wrote about last week on Steel City Underground. We did kind of a group column that Joe put together that discussed the Mount Rushmore Steelers edition. And it got quite a lot of play because, the Steelers have an interesting problem in that, well, they got a lot of guys who are worthy of being on Mount Rushmore, Steelers Mount Rushmore, and they're just only four heads. As always, I'm joined by my Neurosonic and the Martavis jersey. And I even got a NeuroBliss here waiting in case I down all this Neurosonic before this is over. Anyway, my idea was based on a lot of the feedback we got on the article, some of the stuff that we kind of came across, some of the stuff that people said was, how could you exclude this person? How can you exclude that person? And it boiled down to the idea that there really isn't enough room on Mount Rushmore for all the Steelers guys, right? So I thought, well, let's try it from a couple of perspectives and see if we can get a definitive version, let's say offensive and defensive. So, I didn't poll everybody at SCU, but I polled myself, which was painful, by the way, and I don't recommend it to anybody else. I said to myself, which of course makes me insane, that it would be interesting to see who I thought were my all-time defensive guys and my all-time offensive guys. And I said the only limitation I'm going to put on this is they have to be within the Super Bowl era, right? So they have to be guys, and what I categorize the Super Bowl era is not ever since there were Super Bowls, but ever since the Immaculate Reception. That's the Steelers Super Bowl era. Okay, so that's how I narrowed it down. So then I thought, all right, let's look at who I would put on my defensive Mount Rushmore. Of course, there's a lot of guys to choose from, and the first two guys essentially are the same that I wrote in the article, belong on any Steelers Mount Rushmore. And the first one, you can't have a Steelers Mount Rushmore. The entire concept is invalidated if it doesn't start with Joe Green. Joe Green, as I wrote in the article, is a definitive personality. And the guy, frankly, he's a 4-time Super Bowl champion, right? He's 10 times Pro Bowl, 6-time first team All-Pro, and I think 2-time second team All-Pro. So that's 8 times he's on the All-Pro team. He won 2 Defensive Player of the Year awards, 2. So there's a lot of stuff going on with Joe Green. And in most cases, people will tell you that Joe Green may be the greatest defensive lineman that ever played the game. He was unblockable. It's frightening to know that, he injured himself. Injured his shoulder at one point during his career, and he was never really the same afterwards, because prior to that, he simply could not be blocked by one guy. He could not be blocked by one individual. After that, he had to figure out how to deal with the weakness on the one side of his body, and he still was a Pro Bowl level, Pro Bowl caliber player, an All-Pro caliber player. Joe Green changed the dynamic of being a Steeler. He was a part of why there is a Steelers way. He took the lessons that Chuck Noll taught and he implemented them within the locker room and, defined certain things. My daughter, if she ever meets Terry Bradshaw, and we'll talk about Brad in a minute. If she ever meets Bradshaw, I think she's going to go right up to him and probably annoy him to no end, because she's going to ask him if Joe Green saved his career. Because we may have all heard the story about Joe Green when Bradshaw was struggling and was going to be replaced by Gilliam, that Green basically said, no, Brad's our guy. And the way Rocky Bleier will tell the story in the History of the Steelers DVD is He said, if Joe Green says Brad's our guy, then Brad's our guy. So, you can see where she's coming from. There's a chance that, without Joe Green's support, Bradshaw doesn't stay the quarterback. And who knows what the franchise does. Although, Gilliam just really wasn't the quarterback that we wanted him to be. And he had issues outside of that. But so, it's probably likely that Brad would have gotten his position back. Anyway, Joe was the be-all, end-all, and he still is for most of the guys. So I think it's clear he belongs on a Mount Rushmore. You cannot have a Steelers Mount Rushmore of any form without Joe Green. So a defensive one certainly has to happen. My second guy is Jack Lambert, for a variety of reasons. First, Jack Lambert is who I wanted to be when I was growing up, right? Jack Lambert is why I watched the Steelers. The stutter step that he used to do, the gap-toothed, Dracula look, the intensity. People used to yell at me playing Sandlot football, "You're not Jack Lambert," and I would go, "Yes, I am," because that's who I wanted to be, right? And it was, Lambert's on the field presence, his intensity, the swagger he played with, and the fact that he completely redefined what a middle linebacker could be and did things no middle linebacker had ever been thought about doing up until that point is why he's the second guy on the defensive Mount Rushmore. I can't get away from those two guys. Those two guys have to be there. Now we've got the point where you get past those two guys where there's a lot of potential. And when I picked my 4 for the article, I decided I'm going to do 2 offense and 2 defense, just to be fair. But in reality, I don't know that I even can continue to support my own decision in that article, because frankly, I can't. I argue with myself about leaving Mel Blount off and having Hines Ward on. Not that Hines Ward's bad. Not that Hines Ward is a bad choice. But how do you leave Mel Blount off? There's a rule named after the guy. He was maybe the most dominant defensive back of his era. And then when they decided you're too big and you're too tough and it's too hard for those poor innocent receivers to get open when you're covering them, and they changed the rule and said you can't do that, he was still good. I mean, they changed the rules on the guy, and he just adapted and continued to play at a Pro Bowl, all-pro level. How do you leave him off? I'm second-guessing myself. I should never have taken him off. I'll tell you, my first iteration was all defense. Because, that's the Steelers. Steelers are a defensive team. That's how they were always known. It's why we say the Steel Curtain. It's how we, I think, define ourselves. It's why Renegade gets played with always defensive stuff. It's a defensive team, or a defensive identity is what we look at. And we all get upset when our defense doesn't live up to those standards, right? So that was my first iteration, and then I decided I got to be fair, and I split it. But if I'm going all defense, how do I leave Mel Blount off? I can't. But if I put Mel Blount on, which I'm done, that means I got 1 spot left, because there's only 4 heads on Mount Rushmore, right? So you can see this is starting to get difficult even again, and it's just a defensive list. So if I put Mel Blount on, that means I got my last spot. And, now you're talking about, how do I not have Jack Ham on? Does Donnie Shell deserve consideration? Greg Lloyd. I think we can exclude Kevin Green. He's a Hall of Famer, but he had a short span in Steelers in Pittsburgh. Pardon me. So, Neurosonic. It refreshes. So, you've got Greg Lloyd. You've got Jack Ham. You've got Andy Russell. You've got L.C. Greenwood, Donnie Shell. Debo. The list goes on and on and on. And how do you leave off any of those guys? Not to mention Rod Woodson. Rod Woodson, maybe the greatest defensive back to ever play the game. Maybe. Arguments can be made. A guy who, deserved to be a multiple Super Bowl winner, but did not get to be one with the Steelers. So, look, despite the fact that Woodson may have been a better overall player. He was an 11-time Pro Bowler, 11 times, 6-time first-team All-Pro. He was on the second-team All-Pro. He was an NFL Defensive Player of the Year. You know, he's got stats, and the only thing that he doesn't have is a ring from Pittsburgh. I got to take points away from him for that. I'm sorry, I have to. If you're on a Steelers Mount Rushmore, you can't have a Super Bowl ring with Baltimore. The Ratbirds. No, it can't be. So Polamalu goes up ahead of Woodson. And look, I hate Zach. I hate him. I hate Zach. Why? Because he gets to see Troy Polamalu all the time. It drives me crazy because the bromance was real. I love Troy. Troy is probably my favorite. It's tough. It's a real tough call between Troy and Debo, but probably my favorite current era Steeler. He's just an amazing player and a fantastic human being. I mean, when you read about him, I shouldn't say I've never met him. I've met him twice, but it hardly even counts because they're just at signings. But he's the nicest guy, and every time you read anything about him, you know, it's just amazing stuff. So anyway, if it comes down to it, here's my defensive Mount Rushmore for the Steelers: Joe Green, Jack Lambert, Mel Blount, and Troy Polamalu. I get it. You know, Jack Ham may have been the greatest outside linebacker of all time, not, a 3-4 or a 4-3 outside linebacker, or 3-4 outside linebacker, but a 4-3 outside linebacker. But he may have been the greatest of all time. How is he not on the list? Well, there's, who are you going to kick off? Who are you going to kick off? You're going to kick off Blount, who has rule changes named after him, who was a dominant defensive back, even after they changed the rules right underneath him? No, you can't. You're going to take Polamalu off? Look, just go back to the interception to win the AFC Championship game. Go back to that fingertip interception. Go back to the dives over the line to get quarterback sacks. How do you take him off? You can't take him off. So I get it. It's a tough call, but I'm sticking with those four: Green, Lambert, Blount, Polamalu. So now we got to go to offense. It's slightly easier. All right, it's slightly easier on offense. We've had great offensive players too, but it's probably not the same depth as defensively. All right, and I'm going to start off talking about Brad, because Brad's not going to be on my Mount Rushmore. I don't think Brad wants to be on my Mount Rushmore, and I'm talking about Terry Bradshaw. Right, Terry Bradshaw. If you'd asked me 5 years ago, Terry Bradshaw is on that Mount Rushmore. He is a icon of Pittsburgh. But he doesn't seem to want to be. I mean, he tears the team down. He doesn't go to Dan Rooney's funeral. He doesn't go to Chuck Noll's funeral. He makes up baloney excuses for why he can't go. It's funeral. People understand, dude, okay? Commitments are commitments, but when something like that happens, nobody's going to, have a fit. He badmouths the team. He badmouths the players to a certain extent. To me, his contributions on the field will remain, iconic. But we don't want a Mount Rushmore that's going to have tomatoes thrown at it, right? We don't want a Mount Rushmore that people are going to be spray painting mustaches on their heads. We don't want a Mount Rushmore that half of the Steel City is going to want to deface. So Bradshaw can't be on it. Sorry, can't be on it. Does he deserve it? Sure, he deserves it as a guy who has the stats, who played the game with, grit, with intensity, with passion, who left it all on the field. He deserves it from that standpoint. Well, I'm sorry, he turned into a cranky old get off my lawn man, right? Get off my lawn, Steelers. That's the way he is to me. Look, and I know, because I am the cranky. I'm in the SCU back rooms. I'm the cranky get off my lawn dad guy. Okay, I am Clint Eastwood in that movie, yelling "Get off my lawn." I do it to Zach and Eric all the time. Tell them to get off my lawn, and I sometimes do it to Nate or Nathaniel. Sorry, Nathaniel. So Brad's not on. Let's just start off with that. So who is on? Well, one of the things I think is important is not only do you have to be a Super Bowl champion, but you got to have a cool nickname. All right. And who has the coolest nickname on the offense? Iron Mike. What kind? Is there a cooler nickname than Iron Mike? I mean, talk about toughness. The Steel City Iron Mike, man. That's it. That's the guy. I love Mike Webster. I loved Mike Webster when he was playing. You watch that guy play. You watch the power with which he played. I know all the stories, steroids, everything else. I don't care. I don't care. It was a different era. Nobody was really paying attention. They asked them to do different things, and Webster was the rock of that Steelers offense. He was to the Steelers offense what Joe Green was to the Steelers defense. And I was lucky enough to have watched Mike Webster's entire career because I'm old, right? And he was just maybe the best center who ever played the game. He was completely unique, did things that centers didn't do. And, he was the guy who played through everything. He was powerful and strong and tough. And he's got the nickname, man, Iron Mike. You can't not put him up there, all right? You can't. So Iron Mike is my first guy on the offensive Hall of Fame, or offensive Mount Rushmore, I should say. The other guy's Franco. Now, Franco made it to my other list, and Mike didn't. That was mostly because when I threw the two up in the air, Mike is probably my favorite, and I decided that wasn't fair because I was being biased. In this instance, I don't care because I got room for both. Franco goes next. Why? Because Franco is Franco, right? Franco is the Immaculate Reception. Without Franco, without the Immaculate Reception, without him doing what he did on that play, without him continuing to be a force in the first Super Bowl and all the other Super Bowls, without Franco, there probably isn't a conversation about all of this. Franco Harris was a Hall of Fame running back, obviously. He was a Super Bowl MVP. He won 4 of them with the Steelers. He was All-Pro. He was on second-team All-Pro. Was he the greatest running back in the history of the game? No, he was not. But Immaculate Reception. And as they say in almost every Franco story, as they say in the Steelers DVD, he had his own army. How can you not put a guy with an Italian army on Mount Rushmore? You have to, or the army will come and get you, right? And line you up for, firing squad. You got to put the guy with the army on Mount Rushmore, and he deserves it. He deserves it. I know Jim Brown used to give him the stuff because he would run out of bounds, but it's smart. He was a smart guy. He probably prolonged his career and he added more yards and more effort, and he won Super Bowls, and he's an icon in Pittsburgh, so he deserves to go on there. So now we've got Mike Webster, Franco Harris. Now, there's just a plethora of receivers. I got to have a quarterback on here, and you know who it's going to be because it's not going to be Bradshaw, and it certainly is not going to be he who shall not be named. So here we go. And by the way, just as an aside, if Rod Woodson would like to blame anyone for him not being on the Mount Rushmore, you can blame he who shall not be named. And if you don't know who he who shall not be named is, go back and figure out who threw 2 interceptions in Super Bowl 30. Then you'll figure it out. Anyway, next on the line, receiver. I need a receiver and I need a quarterback. I got a running back. I don't want to have 2 running backs up here. So, and it was a toss-up between Franco and Bettis, but I decided Franco because the Immaculate Reception gets the nod. And he's got 4 Super Bowls to Bettis's 1. I could go Ward, could go Stallworth, could go Swan. Louis Lips, very good receiver. Santonio Holmes made the catch that saved the day, right? But, look, on the main list, I put Hines Ward on. And why? Because Hines Ward owns, I think, at least for the moment, he's renting them probably until AB catches up. And AB will probably supplant him on this list at some point and make his name be known to be on the Mount Rushmore. But right now, Hines still has more of the Steelers records. Hines has something that Antonio Brown does not have. Super Bowl rings. Till AB gets Super Bowl ring, He can't be on Mount Rushmore. I'm sorry, I already said it. You got to be a Super Bowl champion to be on Mount Rushmore. If you're not a champ, you're off. Okay, so that's why I'm going with Ward over AB and over any of the other Steelers great receivers that we've had. Look, Lynn Swann, a Hall of Famer. John Stallworth's a Hall of Famer. And John Stallworth is my alternate. John Stallworth was my favorite receiver growing up. Swann was dramatic. Swann was acrobatic. Swann made splash catches. John Stallworth just played forever and did the job well, above board. He was an all-pro level receiver with Bradshaw, and with the detritus of quarterbacks that followed him, he still maintained a high level of performance, even with not so great quarterbacks. So that says a lot, because a lot of times, and people have had the conversation of, especially with guys like Emmanuel Sanders and Mike Wallace, and guys who left the Steelers, did Ben make them better, or did they make Ben better? And you can make the case that without a great quarterback, sometimes receivers aren't very good, because you still got to have the guy throwing you the ball, right? Well, Stallworth managed to be good even with bad quarterbacks. So it's hard to leave him off this list, but I got to go with Hines. It's the smile. It's the attitude. It's the crackback block on Rivers of the Bengals that broke the guy's jaw. It's the fact that he was voted the dirtiest player in the league. It's all those things, right? Hines was, if there could be a receiver who lived up to the Steelers' legacy of toughness, it's Hines Ward. It's got to be Hines Ward. And you got to have that smile up there. And he's got 2 Super Bowl rings, and he's got a Super Bowl MVP. He can be on the Mount Rushmore. All right. So Hines is there. I looked this up, and before I put the quarterback's Ben, let's be real. We all know it. If I'm going to put a quarterback on my offensive Mount Rushmore, it's Ben. Ben owns almost every Steelers passing record that there is. One of the few that Bradshaw still maintains over him is 4 Super Bowls versus 2 Super Bowls, but they both have Super Bowl rings. Bradshaw has more. And if Bradshaw was embracing his legacy, if Bradshaw was maintaining his ties to the team and honoring those who went before, maybe I'd leave him on here instead of Ben. But I can't. I've explained why. So it's Ben. And I tried to look up all of Ben's records, and I'm not going to go through them all because there's just too many. But look, he was one of the youngest quarterbacks to ever win the Super Bowl, if not the youngest quarterback to ever win a Super Bowl. I think at 23, and then he was the second youngest quarterback to win a Super Bowl after Tom Brady, I think, to win, I should say, his second Super Bowl. The thing that I keep remembering, and I was at the Joe Green game, their second Ravens game, where he threw 6 touchdown passes after throwing 6 touchdown passes in the Indianapolis game the week before. And, I mean, just think about that. 6 and 6. He threw 2 games in a row, 12 touchdown passes. The only quarterback in the history of the NFL to do that. The only quarterback, think of all the quarterbacks in the NFL. You got Drew Brees, who throws for a gazillion yards every year, right? He's always at the top. Drew Brees has got 1 500-yard game. Guess how many Ben has? 2. Guess how many other quarterbacks have 2? 0. He's the only quarterback in the history of the NFL to have 2 500-plus yard games. And I'm here to tell you, I think this year he gets his 3rd, if not his 4th. Oh, that's how confident I am in the team this year. It's going to be explosive, man. I think Ben could get the other thing he would love to have as recognition, which is an MVP. Doesn't have that yet. But, if you're going to pick between Bradshaw and Ben, Ben has the stats. Bradshaw has the rings. Ben had some issues, as we all know, early in his career. But you know what? The kid, or the man, he really, he came to an epiphany, however it was that he needed to come to it, and has set his life in order. He's a father figure. He's a leader on the team. He does the right things. He could have gone in a completely different direction. He could have become a very petulant, spoiled brat on the team, which, was kind of the image sometimes that people thought about him but it was early on. But I think he's just young. I don't think he was a spoiled brat. I think he was just young. And, we're not in his shoes. We're never in any of these guys' shoes. We all wish we were, but we're not. So Ben's the final guy. So you've got my defensive again, Joe Green, Jack Lambert, Mel Blount, and Troy Polamalu. My offensive Mount Rushmore is Iron Mike Webster, Franco Harris, Hines Ward, and Ben Roethlisberger. And there's guys, there's just so many guys I could have added, and I had to leave them off. Again, it's still not enough. How crazy is that? How do I leave Debo off? The guy has the greatest play in Super Bowl history, and he doesn't make the mountain. It's nuts. It's crazy, right? It's crazy. I don't know how you make those decisions. Let's say, what if I broke it down by era, and I said I'm going to have a 70s era, 70s, 80s era, and then a 90s, 2000 plus era, right? Even with that, just on the 70s teams, off the teams that won 4 Super Bowls, there's way more than 4 guys who deserve to be on it. There's more than 8 guys. I think, look, if you just said, I'm going to have an offensive and a defensive Mount Rushmore from the 70s teams, right? Well, you got who? You got Joe Green, Jack Lambert, Jack Ham, Mel Blount. That's 4 on the defense. Boom. I don't think you can argue that any of them shouldn't be there. You got Webster, you got Swan, you got Franco, you got Stallworth. I'm leaving Bradshaw off for the reasons I've stated above. But that's 8. And again, you can yell at me and scream and say Bradshaw should be on. And I get it. I understand. It's my own personal view that he's kicking himself off of here. So that's 8. But there's other guys. There's L.C. Greenwood, who should be in the Hall of Fame. Donnie Shell, who should be in the Hall of Fame. And they're not, but they were great players, right? And that doesn't even touch on pre-70s. You got Ernie Stotner and Bill Dudley and, John Henry Johnson. And there's other guys who are Hall of Famers that we aren't even talking about to be on Mount Rushmore. And Stotner's the only other guy other than Joe Green with his jersey number retired. How could you not put him on Mount Rushmore, right? So if we do that, it still doesn't work. I guess the point is, this is a great problem for us to have, right? And we might be looking right now at another guy in Antonio Brown, who is going to make his case for why he should be on the list. Potentially another guy in Le'Veon Bell, who may make his case. And I've even talked about leaving Jerome Bettis off. I love Jerome Bettis. How do I leave Jerome Bettis off the mountain? So any of these, but I got to, because there's too many other guys. But you got Le'Veon. You've got, Debo, who's still making his legacy. You've got Ryan Shazier. You've got guys who could, in 10 years from now, be putting their names up for being on a Steelers Mount Rushmore. But for right now, I think that's how it is. The interesting thing about this exercise is I don't think you can argue about Joe Green. It's the one guy I don't think, and I know we had a person at SCU, and I'm not going to call her out. No, Terry, I'm not going to call you out. I swear I'm not going to call you out, Terry. I'm not going to call you out, Terry, for not putting Joe Green on, and I know why, because you're such a young spring chicken. You never saw Joe play. Go back and watch the tapes. Joe is the guy that nobody should be able to argue with. He has to be on the list. But it's interesting. We have so many great players, so many Hall of Famers, and it's just an interesting exercise. So I had some fun with this. Hopefully you guys did too as well. OTAs are going on, and next time around we'll try and talk about the upcoming season, how OTAs have gone, and how we move ahead. Until next time, as Joe would like to say, stay safe and be good. I'll talk to you later.
We would like to thank you for listening and remind our listeners to follow us on social media and our website, www.steelcityunderground.com.